Guys, it can't be that big of a deal, right?
Why should it be? America, less Christians. Muslims are the enemy.
Well, that's true in most of America, but not in Silicon Valley, sadly.
Sadly?
You can be openly polyamorous, and people here will call you brave. You can put microdoses of LSD in your cereal, and people will call you a pioneer. But the one thing you cannot be is a Christian.
Do you think that, given the clear and complex influence that AI can have over religious belief or that relationship, will religious communities want to start to become engaged in the AI development or maybe innovation process more broadly? Is there a convergence here in terms of the actual communities that are motivated to create these technologies or to create religious communities?
Yeah, it's there's a couple of different reactions to that. So Heidi Campbell does a lot of work here, and she's at Texas A&M, and she says there's religious organizations can look at technologies as sort of neutral conduits of information. They can look at them as very threatening to their existence and and to the information that they provide to people. Or they can look at them as sort of like a missional tool to achieve some goals. And, she goes through a lot of different examples of where, mostly religious organizations that try to restrict access to technology or dissuade their flocks from using technology are largely unsuccessful. Like whether it's a kosher cell phone or somehow stay off of the internet, or there's a God tube it doesn't seem to work very well. And so that's one reaction. I'm sure there'll be a lot of that kind of reaction to AI as well. It's just sort of stay away from it. On the part of a lot of religious organizations. I think that would be expected and natural. Now, whether they're successful or not is another question. I think, some organizations have looked at, so like the AI and faith group that I'm a part of, there's people from all different backgrounds, both religious and non-religious, who are interested in how these systems are being put together from an ethical perspective, and saying, hey, there's wisdom encapsulated in religions that could be useful in this way. Now, that's different than saying, I think this technology should be used to promote one religion or another. So that's another, there's sort of the stay away from it. There's the engage with it relative to the ethics. And then there would be the sort of use it to sort of further the cause of recruitment or mission. And I haven't seen anything really specifically that where an organization has picked up AI, a religious organization has picked up AI and sort of worked with it and tried to develop a solution and get people to use it and sort of push it out there. In fact, when we did, one of the experiences in the research was for people to do internet searches for these questions these core questions that I had, and surprisingly, there was very little advertising even placed in these types of queries, in these types of searches, and so it tells me that it isn't a very rich area that churches and religious organizations have invested in. I was surprised, as were my participants, by the sort of lack of investment in the space. So that's just a little bit of what I saw and what I know about organizations using it.
We saw something about Facebook, I think, right? Guys partnering with religious institutions.
Right. But it seems like the demand might be lacking, at least in terms of the U.S. religious communities. I can almost imagine a world where AI is even more pervasive than it is now in providing us with services and helping us gather information. But that maybe for the religious communities that do exist in the future, this will be an area where AI has no data, where it is very hard for AI to engage or analyze this aspect of human behavior. I'm wondering whether you think that's a good thing, or if that's even a possibility, or if AI will inevitably take on some kind of decision-making role, even in religious life.
I think it certainly will try to provide answers to questions for people. I mean, even now, if you play around with GPT-3 or other systems, like there's information there, where's it getting that information? Well, it's getting it from the internet, and most of the internet is has English-based content, Western-based content. So there's inherent bias in the content. And that's sort of like the crux of the issue with AI in general is sort of what are we feeding these systems? And there's a lot of there's a lot of religious information out there. I mean, I in particular in my experiment, I avoided crowdsourced data, but Wikipedia, for example, if you were to go to Wikipedia, there's lots and lots of information about different world religions. And however, most of it, if you look at the contributors to Wikipedia, most of them happen to be, white Western males. And so, what's written there could be accurate, but it also is likely to carry, a particular perspective. And so I think, my concern would be more in terms of there is a lot of information out there, and what's being ingested and what's being prioritized, particularly if you think about like the sort of short, sort of one-shot answers that we've come to rely on in attention engineering and in voice interfaces. The amount of information and the sort of the context and the texture that can be given is getting increasingly smaller, and sort of as we tend to demand less and less in a way, and so I don't think and to the point of like continuing to avoid it, religious information. I mean, I don't think that's going to be the case. Like I think it will be hard to sort of hard code or wall off these systems from these areas, and increasingly they'll just get better and better at generating natural language and trying their best to try to keep us engaged, I think is probably the design point.
Shanen, you sound quite optimistic with the application of, some of these technologies and kind of how they can push us to be a bit more critical or a bit more willing to listen to other viewpoints. And I'd like to hear you talk about AI and faith and some of the work that's going on there that I think embodies some of that optimism, the goals that AI and faith has, and also how those goals get us closer to the best applications of, our AI, and kind of nudging us into perhaps more consensus building. I'm just curious how we get there and what that work is looking like.
Yeah, AI and faith is really, it's sort of one part think tank. It's a collection of people who are interested in this subject area of the intersection of AI and technology with spirituality. And then it's one part consultancy in terms of engaging with companies who want to talk about this area and then have some insight around potentially the ethics that they're setting up inside of their organizations or that they want to apply to their systems. And it's one part sort of a media kind of company in terms of just putting out newsletters and information about the space to get people educated and engaged. And the thing that is really great about AI and faith is the diversity of the members. We have people from all sorts of different backgrounds. We've got religious officials, we've got former technology people, we've got legal experts and the like. And so really what we're trying to do is form a community in this space that's a great resource for companies to turn. And when they're posed with some of these questions, like what are we going to do about religious information on our platform? What are we going to do about these questions when they get asked? What are some considerations for it? A lot of companies publish sort of I'll call it like a platitudinal level set of guidelines. We want to be transparent, we want to protect privacy, we want to be fair. But it's sort of hard to get down to the layer of, okay, like I'm an engineer sitting inside of a massive, multi-billion-dollar, company, and I have to make decisions sort of about how the algorithms are working. How do we reach that person? How do we give them a set of tools to sort of understand, what's going on there?
Well, I don't know. I'm just thinking about a reading we had that we had from a class where a lot of the technologists expressed that they felt like they were being asked by nature of their roles to make a lot of these decisions that they felt quite uncomfortable with. And to me, it seemed like they were looking for more information. And I don't know. I don't know if it's much of a question more than a comment, but I'm just kind of stuck.
There was that IBM researcher famously that was tasked, I think, with setting the privacy standards for maybe it was like an email, and his boss just told him like, do the right thing, and he said like, I don't know enough. He said like, I don't know enough about religion to do this job right now. He like took time off, studied religions, and then like ended up never coming back to work.
Yeah, exactly. And like part of it is like, if we're going to have some proper application to this technology, it sounds like we need more data and more information, and perhaps it could be an argument for even more surveillance. So I'm just kind of curious, how do we how do we make our technology more perceptive and with more perspective as well, without also kind of arguing for more uncomfortable, data mining. Religious life and spiritual life is quite personal. And so, I'm just kind of curious on how you all think about that and how you all kind of balance that line. Yeah,
I think that there's there are multiple kind of sort of ethical frameworks that can be used here. There's sort of a top-down kind of ontological view, which is like sort of the classic sort of don't be evil, do the right thing, kind of those like I said, those sort of platitudinal level things. I think every company should have those. Like they should definitely sort those out, figure out what they stand for and what they want people at a very high level to carry around with them in their organizations. I think that's useful. There's often also a sort of a teleological kind of framework that has to do with consequences and sort of like what are the consequences of sort of like the means justify the ends kind of thing, or as long as nobody gets hurt as part of this process, it's okay. And so there are other frameworks that can be used there. I think one that is often also used as like a virtue model, where like a particular founder or set of founders at a company says, this is what I believe, and I think we should kind of try to, that should be embodied in the work that we do. Obviously, like religion and spirituality seems to be a carve out typically in that model. There are very few leaders that sort of weigh into this space. But I think, there's, for me, that like you were saying, that I don't know that it necessarily has to be more surveillance, but I do think there should be some aspect of looking at how do people feel qualitatively after using this. So there's lots and lots of studies and work that companies do about testing their products and sort of which direction should we go, and how should we use how should we implement things. I think there should be something akin to like a drug trial around AI, where people, like real people, need to use the system. we need to see if there are side effects, from using it. Are people more anxious after using the system? Are they happier? Are they sadder? Like, what those things are, we know how to test for that. We know how to evaluate that. And in some sense, I feel like we need that kind of a structure around this tool, because it's so intertwined with human interaction, human psychology, brain chemicals, all of the like. I think these are things that we need to develop a perspective on. And these aren't things that companies want to hear or they don't want to do. I think it's but it is work that we need to look at. I mean, at the end of the day, we need to figure out whether these systems are detrimental or helpful, and we need to look at it. I think we don't want this to become like we didn't know smoking was bad for you. We shouldn't be caught in that position here.
I'm just fascinated by the idea of using emotional response as a metric for AI. Because so many, privacy bills in Congress today, privacy laws elsewhere in the world, they'll require, continuous assessment for validity, but that'll often be based on the integrity of the data, the different data sources, and then providing basic control rights to the individual about that data itself. But we don't really look at how, for example, certain misinformation campaigns make people feel.
I think that this is more of a trend. Like, I think there is more of this going on now. I read something about Apple implementing metrics that can automatically detect when people are showing signs of depression on their phones.
Oh, yeah.
There was also like those internal documents leaked within Facebook, like within the Instagram team, of like how Instagram affects young teens. So I think that people, but it's always after the fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
after, there's a pretty good hunch that we're not particularly excited about.
Yeah, but to include that information into our metric for validity or for the trustworthiness of AI, that seems profound to me.
Yeah,
it seems like we could expand that beyond a religious context.
I think, unless anyone else has any more comments, that we have. Thank you so much, Shanen, for coming. We still have a lot more questions, but we try not to keep our listeners too long. But thank you so much for joining the conversation. This was incredibly insightful, and I feel like we hopefully shared a little bit of new knowledge with the world. Maybe happiness as a metric.
Yeah, Shanen, thank you, and your research is very special. Yeah, that's in our view. So thank you again for coming on.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
So welcome back to, just us on the periphery.
It's us again.
Great conversation today. Super interesting. And honestly, I found it super refreshing to sort of have kind of this more humanistic conversation about some of the innovations that are happening. What did you guys feel?
Well, I thought it was really interesting how Shanen perceives AI and these digital assistants as also a way for people to really further reflect on their own religious beliefs and to engage with a source of information, a source that might be tailored to their specific beliefs, but also to learn more about just other religious beliefs as well. Like, I thought his comment about kind of the root of misunderstanding between religions or even conflict often being ignorance. I think that is very true. And I think if these tools can be used in that kind of educational way, almost as kind of a spiritual companion for you to reflect in different stages of your life, I think that could be really powerful and useful.
And on the other hand, he mentioned how AI technologies today, the online environment today, is attention oriented, that it's designed to grab you and to make sure that you're that has your attention and it has your eyes for as long as possible. And one way to do that, in fact, perhaps the most effective way today, is actually by exacerbating conflict, which is the danger. Talking to him made me think back to the years after 9/11, when Islamophobia in the United States reached a huge peak, and we were seeing hundreds of hate crime cases. And I feel like if we had the AI systems we have today back then, I just feel like it would have been even worse. This goes so much more to designing AI and orienting them completely differently from the way we do today, if we want to prepare it to engage with us religiously.
We talk about religion, but to me, the biggest takeaway was all the different applications that this can have to have these uncomfortable conversations, so long as it's, when we're asking the proper questions of who's developing the tech and for what reasons. I'm kind of thinking, there's a statistic, I think it was like, for every white person to have a black friend, every black person would have to have like 8 white friends, or 8 white friends. It'd be like it'd be a huge load. And like all of last year,
such a burden.
All of last year, there was like all these conversations about like, do you have black friends? Like all these things are markers of, evidence that you're having these hard conversations that we wanted to have last year during like a lot of these racial awakenings with Asian American communities as well as Black American communities. That when you look at the numbers, it's a bit difficult just on a number basis to have those conversations with people you trust, where you can be comfortable enough and have the trust to actually find consensus and understanding. And I'm just thinking about the times where I got 20 million calls all of last summer. It was so draining because I was the only black person people knew to ask these questions. And I was really encouraged that people wanted to learn and listen, but I oftentimes felt out of my depths. And I oftentimes just felt a bit drained because here I am experiencing these events. But how awesome would it be if there was, Alexa designed with a ton of, social scientists, X, Y, and Z, and, educators, and, just like a really broad way to get some authority in our Alexa, where it's like, I can ask the question just saying, well, what is here? And at least be pointed to more nuance than, where if I'm asking an uncomfortable question, it's not going to be met with an emotional response that might be warranted, but nonetheless, an answer would potentially get you closer to consensus building.
Yeah.
So
we mentioned in that in our conversation the Eliza effect, and this kind of goes to trust, which is that trust in machine to human interactions is weird. Because, back in the 70s, a guy named Joseph Weizenbaum, he created it's just this simple software program, not artificially intelligent in the way that we would describe it today, called Eliza. And basically, people would type in a comment like, my mother is making me angry or something. And Eliza would respond with a basically pre-programmed generic response, like, tell me about your family, or why do you feel angry? And it turns out that people gravitated toward this software so much that they told it their deepest, most personal secrets and information that they would never actually tell even a therapist. The reason why was not because they knew that Eliza could understand them, because they couldn't, and they knew that, but because they never trusted, that they would not ever trust someone who had the actual capacity to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in an interesting position right now where we are quite ambivalent towards these technologies, right? These artificially intelligent entities, where on the one hand, I think we're all clear about the fact that it really just comes down to code, and it's just running a series of calculations, really. But on the other hand, there's a kind of mystery to it, and I think what was interesting that Shanen mentioned was that people are always trying to find a way to ascribe meaning to it, to interpret it, and so it's got this almost kind of enchanted nature as well, although it's just code. But then again, code could be enchanted because it's doing all of these unpredictable things and drawing all of these conclusions and making calculations beyond what most people can understand. So I think it's just a really interesting ambivalence that's going on right now with these kinds of digital assistants and artificially intelligent entities. And as they get more powerful, I think our ambivalence will only grow.
Yeah, it is mystical to the extent that it's mysterious to us. And that, like, also too, we talked about like the singularity and how there's a lot of crossover with the idea of the singularity and like the apocalypse or like the second coming, and like how the singularity being the time at which like technology advances and becomes so sophisticated that it's uncontrollable, that it controls itself.
So I'm seeing kind of two dynamics here, I think, which is one, the potential for AI with religious knowledge to strengthen interfaith dialogue, to promote interreligious understanding, because perhaps we may be in a position to trust AI to give us interesting spiritual or religious knowledge, more so perhaps than we would actually have engaging with a religious leader from a different religious group.
Even though at some level they're still doing that interaction because the religious leader will be inputting the information.
Yes, but also perhaps the AI would be attuned and learning from the particular spiritual beliefs of individuals. On the other hand, Shanen mentioned how different cultural and religious contexts actually manifest their technology differently. That, for example, in a Japanese context, they're much more physical and analog with their machines. That they are gravitating toward a robotic priest named Mindar. And on the other hand, and I guess in a more Western context, we're used to the disembodied voice, as Shanen described. That we kind of want this kind of otherworldly or disembodied form to our religious authorities. Those two dynamics, I think, are both at play as AI tries to grapple with religion, and it will try to eat religion, just as it tries to eat everything else.
I'm just gonna come out and say, I'm not sure I'm that satisfied. I think this conversation is really interesting, and I think that, especially because not a lot of people are talking about this, like religion and spirituality in Silicon Valley. But I just feel like there's a bigger issue, at least when I think about artificial intelligence and I think about religion, I'm thinking about ex machina. I'm thinking about we've arrived, we've got this super intelligent machine. And the issue is not oh, well, how will people feel about the fact that Siri told me that life is meaningful or not meaningful? It's no, there is a machine and it's making decisions. And how is it making decisions? And what values are built in to its decision-making process? And that, it's a twofold problem. There's the technical problem of how are you going to assign values for a machine to help it make decisions? Because if a machine is making decisions based on, if it's goal-oriented, it's got some goal that it's supposed to use to make decisions, because presumably there are too many potential possible hypotheticals for us to pre-code everything it's supposed to do for the rest of forever. How could you possibly train a machine to keep that one goal in mind when you have to explain that goal in computer language, which fundamentally roots back to math? We can't even agree in our very robust many languages what happiness is. There's no consensus. I just think it's impossible. Well, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I don't know. I'm so curious about how this would be done, frankly, because I think it would be so hard to do this. I don't think it's being done. And yet at the same time, we're pursuing this super intelligence, right? We're presumably there are researchers trying to achieve AI, true, genuine artificial intelligence. And so first of all, how could you possibly train it with values? And second of all, I think, and this is part of what Shanen was talking about, how are we gonna decide what the values are gonna be? Who gets a say? Which religions and in what way are we going to describe what things are good? Because sometimes value systems conflict. Are we gonna program it with a categorical imperative a la Kant, or are we is it gonna be a utilitarian machine? I just think these are the things that I think, frankly, I'm interested in, because they totally freak me out.
I mean, I kind of feel like that's also, to some extent, what he's getting at is our values are, we're there, we are there. It's not
we're where?
Or we're already there into a place where I don't really think it matters if we're going to reach true AI or not. Our interaction and how it's affecting us is perhaps not going to be even more affected. We're sincerely affected in large ways that we're learning more and more about as more research is done. So I'm we're already kind of there. So I mean, I think you're right. It is pushing us in these ways. So we should be thinking about we should be having these conversations about how are our values actually embedded, because they are. And I don't think we know how, because this is this mystified little equation. And then how do we get our actual values embedded? Is it technical, or is it how we actually approach our relationship with technology? Is it, I'm not convinced that we need to be genuinely AI to have being already affected by, the big boogeyman that's to come.
I'm not saying we're not affected. I'm just saying, imagine that, far, far in the future, this is a dystopian hypothetical. AI is the government, and so they make laws, and they're nothing like, maybe there's something like the laws we have now, but maybe just start from a blank slate.
Yeah.
It is going to presumably decide what those laws are because it's so smart and has all the information and can make the best decisions, but fundamentally it has to trace back to some rooted goal or value that is so abstract, but it's going to eventually have to come to on its own unless we're gonna preemptively decide what it is, but we can't agree on what it is.
I think, I think our conversation with Catherine Romero from Microsoft, I think, is instructive in this regard also. I think one point that she made that I found interesting and that I think applies to the situation is that AI and the kind of systems that we're going to be putting out into the world, they're never a finished product. They're always evolving. Yeah. So it's always an iterative process. We're never going to say, now we have completed the process of, coding this entity, and now it's going to go out into the world and all of its actions are going to be completely predictable. They're not going to be completely predictable because it's always going to be learning, and it's always going to change based on the data intake. And so while I think it's important for us to kind of have the conversation about what are some of the basic values that we want AI to pursue, I think that ultimately some of this will also just be beyond our control. And I think we're going to kind of be adjusting as we go, kind of like we did with nuclear weapons. I don't think we really knew what it meant when nuclear weapons first came onto the scene. I don't think we'd kind of developed a coherent ethical framework of how to deal with that situation. We kind of just, I don't want to say figured it out, but we kind of adapted to a new situation and then developed a framework. So I think it'll probably be similar with AI, where we will just have to also be flexible and be willing to adapt to this new situation.
Yeah, I guess sorry, I'm being so annoying about this, but
it's scary, in
nuclear weapons, at the end of the day, we still have the buttons, right? Mm-hmm. But this is a different thing. This is the thing, the event.
It's no longer in human hands.
Right. It's just not going to be up to us.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've done it.
So bleak, but
on that positive note.
Didn't we say we were optimists before?
We're optimists.
It's late in the season,
Well, as usual, we have more questions at the end than we started with.
So
we hope
give us some answers.
I'm sensing a theme here.
But we hope that you enjoyed the conversation as well, that you enjoyed hearing about Shanen's research, and that you have your own questions, which we would love to hear. So, please give us reviews and comments. Check out our Patreon as well, where we have a lot of interesting additional content to continue this conversation. And we're looking forward to seeing you next time.